Welcome. Good evening. I want to just remind everyone before we start to disable your mics and enable your cameras before we begin and for the duration of the talk, if someone has a mic turned on. And then when we get to the end of the talk, if you, I really encourage you to speak up and turn your mic on and ask questions directly to our visitor. So this evening, we're joined for our fall visiting speaker series, current talk by Victoria Udondian, UB Center for Diversity Innovation Distinguished Visiting Scholar. Victoria Udondian creates work that question notions of cultural identity and post-colonial positions in relation to her experiences growing up in Nigeria, a country flooded with cast-off goods from the West. In her fabric works, Udondian is especially interested in how stories become history. Her work is driven by her interest in textiles and the potential for clothing to shape identity. Informed by the histories and tacit meanings embedded in the everyday, she engages with repurposed materials to question how fundamental changes in a fabric can affect one's self-perception. Udondian's work with cast-off clothing has been a strategy for thinking through the consequences of the overproduction of consumer goods, not as celebration of cultural hybridity, in her words, but as a serious commentary on the societies that fabrics may move between. For example, projects like Udondian's Secondhand Museum address a point in which the influx of foreign and exotic fabrics contributed to the decline of local textiles traditions. Udondian's work is a critical inquiry into the complexities that arise when traditional modes of production are confronted with global economic circumstance. Udondian's works have been exhibited internationally in Lagos, Venice, New York, the UK, at venues such as the inaugural Nigerian Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennial, the Fisher Landau Center for the Arts in New York, the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester, among many, many others. Udondian is a recent recipient of the Pollock Krasner Grant and a current Guggenheim Fellow. As I mentioned, Victoria is here as a UB Center for Diversity Innovation Distinguished Visiting Scholar. We're pleased she's joining us tonight. We welcome Victoria Udondian.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that introduction, Max. I'm very excited to have an opportunity to be here at UB. And just to follow up on, before I get into the talk, for those of you who are students, I think I just want to mention, I just realized that some of the art students might not be aware that the Center for Diversity and Innovation in UB actually brought about 9 scholars from various fields to UB, and students have the opportunity to actually choose a scholar to work with. And I think there is a survey monkey going around at this time for students to apply and choose scholars they could work with. And I think this is an amazing opportunity for students, and you should take out some time to look at the SurveyMonkey online. So I think you should find that on the Center for Diversity Innovation Department online and apply to work with any of the scholars that you might find interesting to work with. And on that note, let's get to the business of the day. I'm gonna share my screen at this point so we get to see images of my work. But just for a little bit of context, I think I should share the screen first. Let's see. Turn this around. Sorry, okay. I'm trying to reduce the grid so I can see my screen properly. So my name is Victoria Udondian, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist. And I do want to start by giving a little bit of context to help for the talk. I will be doing some sort of a chronological presentation of my work, and I will be looking at works from around the last maybe 10 years of my career. And I do also want to mention that I'm originally from Nigeria. My practice started from there. This is important information to give context to most of the works we'll be looking at. And so, Mike, I'm having a problem. Okay. Okay, this is working now. Okay. And so, as Max mentioned, I'm very interested in overlapping histories. I'm interested in global trade systems. I'm interested in post-colonial discourses in relation to my experiences growing up in Nigeria. And I do want to explore, sorry, what's going on with my screen? I do want to explore, interested in exploring the mythology of this separate spheres. So looking at Africa and Europe, and in creating this, I'm sorry, I'm trying to just pull this away so I can see my screen properly, okay. So looking at exploring the mythology of these separate spheres, so looking at Africa and Europe, and in creating the overlap of these complexities. And I think the art helps me to do this a lot better. And as a product of the British colonization, being what I would call a hybrid culture, it opens me up to the space to question the determination of African and European discourse. So I'm very interested in how, you know, the impact, the influence of Europe on Africa and vice versa. And one of the ways of doing that has been looking at the secondhand clothing industry as a point of departure. And my work focuses a lot on, you know, investigating these histories. I've been interested in the histories of secondhand clothing, of this material, and how this histories becomes complicated when you have clothing getting shipped from the West to the global South. And when the locals from a country like Nigeria collects this used clothing and begin to wear them. I'm interested in those complexities. So the first work I'm gonna be talking about is a project that I did in 2010. I was invited by the Center for Contemporary Art in Lagos, amongst 10 artists, to work on the theme of independence. At the time, Nigeria had turned 50. And so we're limited to the color green, being the national color of Nigeria. And by this time, I was already investigating the secondhand clothing market and how this market, how the influx of used clothes, cast off material from the West is impacting local textile production. And so eventually I visited the secondhand clothing market in Lagos, where I collected all these used clothes and repurposed them into this installation. And of course, this project, I revisited it again in 2013, and you will get to see that in the course of my presentation. While I was working, or before I actually got to this project, I did investigate a lot around the histories of secondhand clothing within Nigeria, as well as other West African countries. I made trips to around Africa, also went to East Africa. We had very similar situations. And that being the fact that Africa has always had to deal with the notions of humanitarianism from the West, right? The West always wanting to sort of quote unquote help Africa. And of course, within this industry, you realize that even though we all donate clothing through for humanitarian purposes, this is not totally the case, as this is a huge business that people from both ends of the coin are making a lot of profit. And so in 2011, I won a residency to go to Europe. While I was in Europe, I was interested in now investigating from the European side what the situation was, where this clothing actually came in from to Africa. And what was fascinating, I got to work with a Catholic organization. We know that Catholic churches have been quite central to these notions of humanitarianism. And so I worked with a Catholic center that actually helped poor people in Italy. I did a residency in Venice in 2011, and the organization was called La Calitizia. So they were very magnanimous in giving me access to their space, introducing me to their processes of collecting donated clothing and how this clothing gets sorted out and shared amongst poor people in Italy. And the collections that they did not need, they would ship it to a larger collecting center. I made an effort to go to the center, the larger center, but for some reason, they didn't want me to come there. They did not want any kind of documentation at all to come to their center. And so Calitizia donated quite a bunch of clothing, used clothes for my project. And one of the works that I did was called the Secondhand Museum. This was actually the first time I was working in Europe and having an encounter with the museum spaces in Europe, walking around most museums and seeing how much artifacts from country Africa was being stored in these places. And also realizing that I had so much more resource, in terms of artifacts from Nigeria, for example, from Africa generally, in Europe, than I would have had access to in Nigeria. And so this got to my questioning the notion of, historical accounts, when you think about museum as a center that history is being preserved. And so I created this body of work. There were about 5 costumes, what I call hybrid costumes, that were made using a combination of scrap from the secondhand clothing that were being donated to me by La Calitizia. I also had donation of exotic textiles from Rubeli. Rubeli is a large exotic textile company in Venice, and they donated quite a bit of textile as well. So I was interested in combining this different various materials that I got from scraps from the secondhand clothing, the used underwears, and with these exotic textiles, Venetian textiles, I'm creating these 5 costumes. And these pieces were now presented in this museological structure. And of course, because it was supposedly a museum, I had to generate some kind of narrative for this work. And of course, it was at that point that I started really getting interested in how stories become history, questioning the veracity of historical accounts through generating my own history. And of course, by doing this, I'm not really interested in revising history, but more interested in creating alternative possibilities and that sometimes requires some kind of fiction or what you might call lie. So I created a text. So this accompanying this piece, like you would have in a museum, had a sequence of text, and this was completely historical accounts that I had generated. But it was based off of this history sort of plays on the notions of artifacts, the collection of artifacts, how it travels the world, from Africa to Europe. And in this case, just to give a little bit of context, the history had it that these 5 costumes were actually produced back in the 60s by a fashion designer by name Sade Thomas Fayom. She actually had the very first the very first tailoring company in Lagos. This is early 60s, so early post-colonial Lagos. And she did also narrate how difficult it was for the locals within the Nigerian context at the time to wear traditional clothing. Remember at this time, it was the early 60s, Nigeria had just gained independence. So people wanted to dress like the white man. They wanted to be modernized, in a way. And so nobody wanted to wear traditional dresses. It's also important to note this because it was at this time that secondhand clothing influx started coming into the country. And so in response to that, the history had it that Sade actually created these costumes in response to these new markets that was just beginning to open up. And she had supplied it to Harrods in London. And there was this Italian who had been in London at Harrods and had collected this costume and later brought it to Venice where we got to see the show. This is just to give you an idea of how the history would be narrated, but of course it was much more layered than that. As part of the secondhand museum, I also created the Venetian portraits. So, walking around museums in Venice, I also noticed that there were a lot of, portrait preservation through the museum. So the Venetian Caprice portraiture idea, I wanted to play with that as well by having people wear these costumes that I had made. And they became a part of the secondhand museum collection. Another work that I created at that time was this series of sculptures that's called Okrika Bell. And in response to how this clothing gets packed in bales and they get shipped to Nigeria, for example, I wanted to reference that by creating some sculptural bells. And so I had collected all these rope. So in Venice, for those of us who've not been to Venice, it's a city without the wheels. So all commute in Venice is either by foot or by on water through the ferry or the boats. And so you had all of this crap of the rope that is used to dock the ferries and the boats, just laying around the boat stops. And so I went around, collected them because I thought it was associated with transportation. And I had all of these sculptural bells that were being wrapped up with this. And the installation went from the floor of the gallery to the stair wall. So sort of thinking about the paradox of shipment within this acceleration on the stair wall. Another piece that I did in Venice, this is the install view of that shot, of that piece. Another piece that I did in Venice was called About 1000. So walking around the museums in Venice, I saw this piece of a red shirt that was hanging on the wall in the museum. And I started questioning, about the red shirt. And in the course of my research, I realized that the red shirt was quite significant to Italian unification. And as of 2011, when I was in Venice, Italy was celebrating her 150 years of unification. And so, and I read about Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a historian, who was one of the major warriors that fought for the unification of Italy. And he had had about 1,000 red shirts for volunteers who were willing to fight with him for Sicily. And so I wanted to sort of make reference to that by collecting this red shirts, part of it from my youth clothing collections that I had collected. And then I created this install that referenced the way that Venetians would dry their laundry. So if you've been to Venice, you will see how laundries get dried from one building to another, the same way this installation was presented. So that was the reference point in having this outdoor installation. That's the detail of that project, of that short. 2012, I got invited by the Whitworth Gallery and the Manchester Gallery to create a piece for an exhibition. It was a commission piece, and the idea for me was to look at the archive. So the Whitworth Gallery has a huge collection of textiles and from different parts of the world, huge collection from Africa. I've actually seen most of the textile artifacts from the continent. Most of it I saw at the Whitworth collection. But what was fascinating as I went through the archives was the fact that some of the collections were donations, excuse me. So they had donations from an archaeologist, I found out, whose name was Frank Willett. He had been in Nigeria on the team of archaeologists that started the first museum in Nigeria in the 50s. And so while in Nigeria, he had collected a couple of artworks, textiles, you name it. which were later donated to the museum and to the Whitworth. And so I thought it was fascinating in thinking about how artifacts would travel from Africa to Europe, and how some of them were donated, and even how some of them were acquired, some of the questionable ways that some of the artifacts we're looking at in Europe were being acquired in Africa. So I wanted to create a textile piece, because I also found out that most of the textiles that I saw from the continent were woven textiles. And I read about the history of woven textile from Africa being dated back to the 15th century, before the Europeans actually set their foot on the continent. And so this is a practice that is sort of fading away because, of course, with mechanized production of textiles, woven textile is not as popular as it was. And so my idea was, after doing my research, to create a large woven textile piece, probably the largest that would have been produced in the 19th century. And I wanted to present it as a possible collection of Frank Willett. And so this piece was titled Asho Ikele 1948. So it was actually presented as though it was produced in 1948. And as a result of that, there was also a brief historical narrative. You know, like I said, I'm very interested in questioning how stories become history, and also the veracities of historical account. And so I had written this short historical narrative for this piece that accompanied the piece. And of course, this history is a lot of times would question again how how artifacts travels the world, how they end up in European collections, for example. That's the install shot for that piece. It was quite a large, humongous piece. So actually the previous image, that's my image, that's me in front of the sculpture. So it was quite large. And that's the detail, and that's the install, and that's the detail of the piece. So most of the material used for this piece were a collection of secondhand clothes, scraps, and used repurposed materials that I had brought with me from Nigeria, and some collected in Manchester. So when I returned to Lagos, I wanted to explore that further, and I created, a bunch of other woven textile pieces that were referencing traditional woven pieces that I had seen in museum in my hometown, but those were actually made out of like raffia and local materials. So I referenced that to create more sculptures. This is one of them. And this is the back view of that sculpture. It was quite three-dimensional. And that's the install of it, another view of it. Why does this happen sometimes? So again, 2013, I decided to revisit the green summary piece. But at this time, I wanted to go to the secondhand clothing market where these goods actually arrive in Lagos. And it's also important to note that the secondhand clothes, it's considered contraband goods in Nigeria. So by law, these goods are not supposed to be shipped into the country. But of course, Nigeria has got some porous borders where people will ship this clothing to the nearby countries like Benin Republic, and through the porous borders, they'll be able to bring these clothes into Lagos. So this market, for example, it's in Badagry, which is like a border town between Nigeria and Benin Republic, which is like a huge hub where this merchandise gets arrives in Lagos. And I wanted to work with the people in the marketplace. So this project was actually actualized within the marketplace. And so within the used clothes market, you would find readily available tailors who would transform clothing for you, or would transform, for example, you bought like a ripped pants and you wanted someone to mend it for you, you would have the tailors in the market who are readily available. So I had to work with most of these tailors in the market. I had collected this bunch of clothing within the market, and I had them transform them in their own ways as they would want it. The project took us a couple of days, and after the transformation, I now had to work with them. We had an install within the market. What was interesting was the fact that even the market, the dealers in this industry, when they saw us coming around with cameras and doing this work, initially, some of them were worried that we maybe came from the government, we were coming to, close their businesses. And it was interesting when most of them spoke to us about the fact that their livelihood was dependent on this business. And as such, they wouldn't want their business to be closed down. So they were in this for their, for their own goods, for their own welfare, moral, so to speak. So at the end of the install in the marketplace, I got various install in different locations in the market. I also collected a bunch of sound. So this is a very rowdy market where it's very noisy. And the sound you will get is sometimes people just yelling and chanting like sales prices for example, just chanting like, oh, this is $1, I buy this for $1. So there's so much noise. And so I collected the bunch of this, sound from the marketplace. And the piece was finally installed in the gallery. And within the gallery space, I had to incorporate the sound into the piece. So when you walk into the piece, you would hear this sound that I had collected that was very random, market sound. And then the same year, I did a project that was actually for an art competition in Lagos. And it was a project on the theme of identity. And so I was interested in exploring identity through clothing. And I want to start by a quote from Barbara Plackensteiner, who is an Austrian person. This text is from a book that looked at the production of embroidered textile in Switzerland for the Nigerian market. So Nigeria has depended a lot on various clothing, textiles from Western countries. I mean, for example, the popular West African textiles that we know about were produced in, they're actually not African, right? But they're always associated with Africa. But of course, the history of it is that it was produced by the Dutch in England, for example, but the history is from Indonesia. But today, all of this textile is associated with Africa. And so I was very interested in how, over the course of time, we have come to accept certain materials as part of our culture. But when you begin to look through all of these threads, you find out that these materials that are supposedly traditional are really not traditional. They're coming from different places. So over the centuries and in countless ways, imported fabrics were thus assimilated into the West African clothing traditions, becoming characteristic components of ethnic costumes that are commonly understood as traditional clothing. I also like to quote an artist whose work I really do like, that all identity construction is a form of reenactment. You were playing a role, and to do so, you have to construct that role. And so in the course of this project, I had looked into the histories of Nigerian clothing, Nigerian textiles, the ethnic styles that are associated within various ethnicities in the country. And I wanted to use all of this influx of imported materials that we usually would have, and then combine them to create supposedly traditional styles. And so these images have some of the costumes that I had made using used t-shirts, some of them are like football t-shirt with the players' numbers. The one to the right is a costume that we made using used underwears. And so, but when you look at the image, you're first drawn to the image as traditional styles, but really the materials are not that. And so I created a series of styles. And for example, the material in this picture, it's called George in the Southeast Nigeria. And I had to do a huge research trying to find out who George was. I didn't get to the end of that because I couldn't figure out who George was, for example. So I was very interested in teasing out all these little elements that we would take for granted within that context while we wear these costumes happily as traditional attire. And these are, the images. So for the final presentation, I had a performance where I had people wear these costumes and they just did it, just sat there and would move. It was some sort of a tableau vivant performance for the final piece. Accompanying the installation was also all of the research that I did. That's what you have on the decks of all the histories of various clothing within different cultures in Nigeria, where they came from, those that were traditional, those that were based on European influences, etc. So 2014, I had moved to the States for my master's, and Center for Contemporary Art was doing a publication on Okai Ojekere, who was a photographer, a renowned photographer from Nigeria. And he had created all these beautiful pictures that you're looking at on the screen of hairstyles from Nigeria in the 60s. And looking at these images, it was at the time the Center for Contemporary Art was trying to raise money for this publication. There was a lot of circulation of these images. And there was something that struck me about these images. I think they were very powerful architectural forms, or sculptural and architectural forms. And so I took, for this project, I think it was a very classical approach, where I took on the idea of threading, which is the process of making these hairstyles, and using that to create my own work. So what drew me was actually the sculpturality and architecturality of this headpieces. And I started creating, forms that became very abstract from that finally was a room size installation. So I work quite large scale, just so you know that. And so these are the very, that was one of the iterations. And then the final piece was a room size installation. And that's the detail from the install. And then 2015, I got invited to represent Nigeria at the inaugural Nigerian Pavilion, which was very exciting. You get an invitation to represent your country in a big show. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Venice Biennale is one of the biggest art exhibition that happens in Venice every 2 years. And usually you would have countries come there to showcase their artwork from their country, the best of their art from the country. And the history of the Venice Biennale is tied to the World Fairs. So when you think about the World Fairs and the idea that the presentations that we had during the World Fairs in the 18th, 19th century were mostly the countries, the superpowers sort of showcasing their colonies, showcasing, in some cases, bodies of people from their colonies for exhibition. And so having been invited to this Biennale, and for some reason, the Biennale at the very last minute did not happen. So Nigeria canceled the pavilion. And of course, this was very late in the process that there was already we were already in the publication, and apparently my work was used in the publication. And so as a result of that disappointment, I decided to create a Nigerian pavilion, the inaugural Nigerian pavilion for the 56th Venice Biennale. And that was a project that ended up taking me about 1.5 years to produce. And for the Biennale, we were about 4 artists that were invited to the show. And so in the course of planning and trying to actualize the Nigerian pavilion that I had envisioned, there were a couple of texts that did inform my thought process. And one of them was a text by this art historian, Carrie Lambert-Bethy, on make-believe, parafiction, and plausibility. And she talks about, the investigation of parafiction in contemporary art. as a fiction that critically intersects with the world as it is being lived, destabilizing the viewer's relationship to facts and subtly altering the worldview. Parafiction produces and manages plausibility. It treats its reality as truth, and it thus plays with the viewer's ability to determine the reliability of the information presented. So Lambert Beatty writes, "This is precisely the territory of parafiction. We are at once reveal the way things are and make sensible the way we want them to be." I might need to turn on my light. And another text that did inform, before I get to the other text, so this ended up being, this ended up being sort of a fictional project that was presented as real. So the project had two parts, had an online life and the real life. And so I created a show that had 4 artists in them, and there was also a curator. So at the end of the day, I had about 5 alter egos, 4 artists and 1 curator. And it was a full curated exhibition with 4 different bodies of work. Another text that informed my thoughts about this project was my interest in the futures. So drawing attention to the incongruence between the mainstream art world as exemplified by a platform like the Venice Biennale. So I was interested in using the idea of the futures in questioning the present. So one of the texts that informed that was a text by Kudo Eshung on further consideration on Afrofuturism. And I will quote Kudo Eshung: "In the colonial era of the early to middle 20th century, avant-gardists from Walter Benjamin to Frantz Fanon revolted in the name of the future against a power structure that relied on control and representation of the historical archive. Today, the situation is reversed. The powerful employs futurists and draw power from the futures they endorse, thereby condemning the disempowered to live in the past." So I wanted to use this opportunity to draw the power from the future in creating a work in the present that would use to, question the future. So I created a multimedia installation project for this project, and by these different artists. This was the final installation of the work. So I'm gonna take us through the different works that were made by these different artists, by the 4 different artists. So one of the artists was a conceptual artist. His name was Rabin Smeh. And so the first work of his we're gonna see is a painting on screen print and canvas. And these 4 paintings were actually a collection of the contracts from the Venice Biennale that was sent to me to sign for the exhibition. So these were the 4 contracts by the 4 artists made into a painting. Another piece that was done by Rabin Smeh was Retired Passport. So this piece was actually drawing attention to the notions of visa, immigration issues. And so this passport was sort of retired in a vitrine, which was actually my Nigerian passport in a vitrine. And there was also an alternative to having passports that restrict movement, to having little postcards that people could actually travel with as documents to access the world. So looking at the restrictions that someone like me have to deal with as a Nigerian in going around the world, who needs visas to visit literally everywhere in the world. That's the reverse view of the piece, the other side of the piece. Another piece that Rabin made was also this Biennale news. So during the 2015 Venice Biennale, there were a lot of, issues around, which is always the case, most of the countries that were in this Biennale. So when you think about the Venice Biennale and what it signifies, being a platform that was created based off of the World Fairs that did not really have any plan or any inclusion for post-colonial countries or put the post-colonies to be part of this very Western idea. So when you visit the Biennale, you find that it's a topography, right? Where you have the big superpower countries, you know, have a space at the Giardini, at the two major locations, and some of these smaller countries that do not really fit into anywhere would just have a little space at the Arsenale, or sometimes they have to rent like a small location in Venice. But of course, you also see like the new power where countries like China, Korea, how, you know, they try to also make themselves very present to show their own, to showcase their own power as well. So within that system, you had a situation where in 2015, a country like Nigeria, who was also trying to be part of this for the first time, could not make it through for, of course, several reasons around maybe funding or whatever. And then you had a country like Kenya that had a representation that was made up of 4 Chinese artists, and the creation was by an Italian. And eventually, the Kenyan pavilion got canceled for this reason. The Minister of Culture had to call it off because you couldn't imagine having a Kenyan pavilion with 4 Chinese artists. But of course, that also speaks to the terrain of China today as the neo-colonialist or the neo-colonial influence on the continent, or maybe, I don't know, quote and unquote. And that same year, Costa Rica had a situation where artists were asked to pay about 5,000 euro to be part of the show. And for some reason it backfired and they had to cancel the pavilion as well. So this Biennale News was actually a collection of most of the stories that are related to some of these smaller countries or post-colonies that are now trying to be a part of this institution that has started without them being involved. And these are some of the struggle and the challenges they're having to deal with. So Frozen Economy was another piece that was done by this artist, Dundee Victoriana. And this is a collection of the secondhand clothing bell that's frozen, that's dipped in resin, so they're rendered useless. And so I call it Frozen Economy. And of course that should, you know, tell what that would mean. I think the intervention on this bell was just like the levels and also the fact that they were frozen in resin, just so they couldn't be useful anymore. And that's the detail of that piece. And another artist on the show was called Ego Goodshire. So Ego created a Monarch series where he created all this costume that referenced the 4 countries that colonized Africa. So the Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium. And these were like mostly cut dresses that were used in, you know, in the 19th century. But of course, this whole costume was also made, they were all hybrid costume made using scrap from secondhand clothing. And so for Ego, who was a photographer, Ego made a presentation of, you know, photographic presentation of these works. And these are the different photographs by Ego. I mean, some of the costumes that Ego also made reference, like traditional quote and unquote cut dresses from Africa as well, from Nigeria, and also had, you know, them worn for photography. So the last artist was Kebe Getz. And so Kebe wanted to produce a possible pavilion for African countries. So as I had explained earlier, if you go to the Venice Biennale, you would not have any location for like countries from Africa. So Kebe thought it would be nice to have an architectural presentation of a possible model for African countries. And so this is a drawing and video animation, and the animation is made up of series of drawings, digital drawings, alongside the video animation of this architectural plan or model of this pavilion. So I'm going to play, these are the images of the drawings. So the video we're about to see next is a culmination of all of these drawings, along with a visual rendering of an architectural model for a pavilion for African countries. This was the presentation of the work in the gallery space. And so I'm gonna play a short video. Oh my God, it's already up to 7. Okay, so the idea was to create some kind of futuristic model that's very utopian and mostly almost impossible to produce. I'm going to move very quickly. I think I might have very little time. So I just want to talk on one last project before we wrap it up. And so the project I want to talk about is a project I started in 2017, which was as a result of my beginning to deal with my own immigration situation. And I had to face a lot of frustration in the process of applying to stay in the United States. And so I started a project called the Republic of Unknown Territory. I was doing a residency at the time in Provincetown at the Fine Arts Work Center. And the Republic of the Unknown Territory is actually a project that subverts the notion of a country. So creating like a micro nation where I run things, where I anchor everything that happens there. So it's me taking up an agency to create a space for my own control of some sort. And so as part of this work, I had a sole exhibition, which was subverting the entire gallery space into the Republic of Unknown Territory. And for everyone who wanted to come into, the show, they had to, okay. For everyone who wanted, goodness, oh, wait. Everyone who wanted to see the exhibition, they had to go through some kind of immigration process. And so the show was set up in a way that if you come in, you have to, go to a table, fill out immigration document, and there was a whole security settings where you had to undergo some kind of visa process, applicating process. And once your visa was granted, you could access the show. So for those who did not get their visas approved, so it's just sort of mirroring the real situation, the real world situation. And what was interesting was I had people who came to the show, filled out a form. Okay, let me stop right there. I'm just gonna show a video of a short clip of the performance, and then we'll talk a little bit about the project, what happened during the performance.
I don't have gonorrhea, do I?
No, Bob, I really can't help you figure that out. You're on your own. Sorry.
I'm gonna go and, man, my heel's gonna sore. That's what I'm scared of. What's that mean? It means you can't walk, right? I think you have like spurs on your bones.
It's when you have inflamed tendons in the bottom of your foot. Can you help me, please? I'm so sorry we're not able to allow you access to the
So you might have
Can you
to,
tell me why? It's better next time?
well,
Was
it's
it the gay thing?
the gay.
It was.
I mean, we try to be very, accommodating in our territory. We do not discriminate against people who are gay,
Okay.
so, but of course, there are a lot of other factors that we do take into consideration in issuing visas to the unknown territory.
Okay.
But I'm sorry we're not able to offer you visas today.
Okay. Do you want me to-
Well, you can reapply at some point.
Is there anybody I can talk to? Is there an appeal? Do you have a manager?
I'm sorry, actually, you really, based on the law, you really can't, you really can't sue for being denied visas, but you actually have a chance to reapply,
Okay.
and your applications will be evaluated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for helping.
Yes, sure, thank you. Excuse me. Excuse me.
What?
You can't go in, sir. I'm sorry.
Oh,
We'll get the police to arrest you, sir. No, you can't. I'm so sorry.
I just wanted to.
I'm so sorry. Please, do you want to stay back? I'm so sorry. I'm so
I
sorry.
think you're
Please.
carrying
Thank you
this
so
on a
much.
bit too far.
It's okay. I'm
No,
sorry.
it's not okay.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I
It's
know.
not okay to,
You shouldn't be.
you have to be a law-abiding citizen in this territory. I'm so sorry. This is not allowed. Thank you. Next, please. Call for the two, call for both of them.
I'm standing here. Really want me in.
Okay.
But
Are you trying to bribe me to let you into the territory? Is that what you're trying to do? I'm so sorry. That is not an acceptable behavior around here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You just can't allow that here. You can reapply sometime and then your case could be reevaluated. Thank you. Next. We do not tolerate any kind of unlawfulness in this territory. This is highly unacceptable. And we're not gonna be here to allow this kind of, on lawlessness. We're not going to allow it.
You're being petty.
If you do want to have access to it, please go through the process, apply for your visas, and if it is approved, you have access. This is why we have to build walls here. We need to build erect like tall walls, because this is not acceptable.
So the interesting thing about this project was a lot of things were not, we did not think it through. Number one, I didn't imagine that someone would want to break the law and force himself through the territory, through the exhibition, the boundary into the territory. But what was fascinating was the fact that this was within a residency setting. And so I had some of the fellows who wanted to come in, who wanted to force themselves in. And then while I was sitting there trying to adjudicate the visas, I did not realize that the fire exit door behind was opened up by people who had access for a lot of illegal immigrants to get into my territory. And then also, most of the refreshment that we had were in the gallery. So you needed access in the gallery to, enjoy the refreshment. And before I knew it, people were passing wine and, food across the border, and, a lot of chaos actually seemed to have happened. And of course, that wasn't anticipated in the course of planning, because if we had anticipated that, we would have been able to make proper arrangement for more security officers to take care of the border wall or the border security. And I'm gonna have to stop here because I think we're running out of time. But I do also want to mention that while I'm here in UB, I have expanded on this idea of the Republic of Unknown Territory. I've worked with immigrants where I'm collecting stories. So I've been collecting what I call artifacts for the Republic of Unknown. And I've been collecting stories from immigrants and first generations in the country who are willing to come work with me and share. I've also been collecting more sculptures of, body parts, like you had in the installation where I had like sculptures of the legs, and I had all these headless forms, a lot of used, things associated with immigration, as well as body parts of people I've been working with, immigrants communities that have been interested. So if you're interested in working with me while I'm here, come talk to me and see how you can be a part of this. So I'll be working on that project alongside with a second project that is also looking into Afro-Sino relationships. So the relationship of China to Africa, which is a whole different project entirely. So thank you very much for being here. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much for sharing your work with us tonight. This is a fantastic presentation, and this is the time of the evening when we usually, we typically have the opportunity for people to ask questions. I know there's a lot of interest just kind of watching some of the comments going by through the chat. So I'll ask that you enable your mics, and we'll just see how we do. Just speak up, and yeah, we have hopefully some questions for Victoria.
I actually have one. It's for the last video that you just showed. Did you get any sort of threat? I'm just curious, like, how was your experience as yourself? How did you feel?
It was, I don't know, I think it was a performance that lasted for about an hour, 30 minutes. So there were a lot of people who went through the process. And what was interesting too was the fact that after the show, I think someone actually wrote, I'm suspecting is a man that I had denied access. He wrote a letter to the gallery, really stating how, his annoyance, and quoting all the gallery laws about the fact that no one should be denied access to the gallery based on the law of the gallery. And also stating that what actually ensued in the email, that I had asked him if he had ever had to apply for visas, and he said no, that maybe I was angry at the fact that he was American and has never had to deal with immigration with visas, so I denied him access, which was really like the idea, but was also really interesting to see how entitled some people would feel that they really think that they have the right to be in the gallery, and for whatever reason. Negating the fact that I'm doing this work because as a Nigerian, I mean, I also have an experience that needs to be put forth, right? As a Nigerian, I need visas to go literally everywhere in the world. But you know, as an American, he could travel with he just need his passport to travel. If I had to travel and I had a layover of 24 hours or more, I'm stuck in an airport because I don't have the visa of that country. That's not the experience of most people here. But the people who take these things for granted because they really don't understand other people's story and they feel entitled. And it was interesting to see that. But on my part, I think it felt empowering. I think it was just, you know, having the agency to be in control and decide who I wanted to be there and where, by way of also questioning, you know, my own realities and the reality of people who look like me.
If you don't mind me asking, what kind of questions were on that visa?
The application form. So the application form was an adaptation of American visa application forms with a few changes. So I did add some very extreme questions to the visa form. So question that bordered on identity. There was a question that asked if you had ever committed an abortion or knew anyone that did. There was very extreme questions of this sort. There was question on religion, excuse me, and then a lot of questions are bordered on finances, which is also a huge part of American immigration process. So it was actually taking the American visa application form and sort of, you know, just adding on some very extreme questions for people to respond to. And it was about 4 to 5 pages, so it was quite a long process, the same way you would find in real life, you know, situation, applying visas to come to America.
There's another question I see also related to that last piece. Ashana, you there?
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Sorry about that. I have it all on mute. I was just wondering, Victoria, it's such a beautiful piece of work and the kind of performance art around it. But I was thinking about this in relation to here being so close to the border and what Haudenosaunee people or Iroquois people have to go through when they cross the border is a lot of harassment and a lot of that. And we're on our traditional lands and there's treaty rights from, you know, early treaty rights in the 1700s before the US was even the US that give us the right to cross that border whenever we want as part of our traditional territories. But I'm thinking about this also in relation to the Tohono O'odham right now, who are experiencing the forcing of a border, not just passing a border, but the forcing of it on their traditional lands. And they're cutting down these like 1,000-year-old Sohora cactuses and creating what the border wall is doing to their communities. They too have treaty rights that are well before the US ever did the 1848 treaty with Mexico, that far precede that. So I guess my question is, when you do this kind of work, how is it place-based, or how do you think about it in terms of like place-based in the environment and what you're in?
I mean, I think it was, for me, it was interesting to do. I mean, I am sitting on American soil, really, and trying to restrict people from getting into a gallery space. Do you know?
Yeah.
So it's literally like taking ownership of a space that is not mine and claiming it. So sort of reproducing the situation that brought America to what it is today, right? Like exactly what we're talking about. And, but for me, the interesting thing is the fact that art has given me the ability to be able to do that. The fact that art has given me the ability to create these alternative possibilities and use them to question whatever notion I might be interested in questioning, right? And so I think it's an agency that I have as an artist. I mean, ordinarily, what business do I have sitting in America and trying to tell you you can't come in here if it wasn't an art, if it wasn't for art, right? But it also gives us an ability to create a platform where these issues can actually be discussed. Because at the end of the day, you know, even from the letter that was written, and everyone who came to the show who had to go through the process, some people actually for the first time got to realize what a process it is to actually apply for visas. I mean, these are things that someone like me might take for granted, but the people who've never had to go through that process, it's such a tedious process. The form is so lengthy, and you have to give away every information about your life and, you know, your financial status. So you had people, for example, who showed up and I'm like, oh, they had written that they had a lot of money. I'm like, oh, you have a lot of money. We need someone like you in our territory. And someone else is filling the form. It's like, oh, it's like if you have a lot of money, they'll let you in. So they'll just create some figures. And they show up and I'm like, oh, no, you're not coming in because maybe I find another reason to deny you. But also showcasing the arbitrary nature of this process. It's so arbitrary. Like you can't really tell why you're denied the visas because someone just determines that you're not worthy. Right? So having the agency to do that, I think, was important. And also have, you know, in a way that other people would be able to experience that, they've never experienced that, and think for a moment what it means for people who have to do this in real life.
Yeah. Does it change with the audience or where you do these kind of performance?
I mean, it does. I did also do it I had it in New York too, but it was also a show that was done to support the New York City Immigration Coalition.
Ah.
So the first time I did it, I did not have visa fees, which was one of the things that I felt was off. So the second time I did it, there was a non-refundable visa fees of $5. So you would pay the visa fees, which would go to the Republic, and you get denied visas and you don't get the money back, which is really what the situation is. Like, you pay American government $160 for visas. They deny you, they don't give you back your money. And then they encourage you that you can reapply. You reapply, you pay the money again, you know? So it's shifted too. And also with the audience in New York, I did not have the situation I had in Provincetown where someone tried to force themselves in. So it's been different depending on context, really.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I mention something real quick? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Is that okay? Yeah, so like in your case that you explain certain things, if you think about what is happening in our retail stores or shopping mall, you can't get into the store until you have a mask on. I feel like it's so close to the concept that you just explained right this moment.
Yeah, that's now, we're looking at the current moment.
And you have to buy a mask, just to buy one mask, you have to buy the whole box. You don't get the refund. That just came out of my mind. Like it's so close to the concept that we're talking about right now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the new normal. We have to deal with how the mask is becoming an industry that people are profiting off of too, besides the fact that there is a huge health pandemic going on. Yeah, but it's the way the capitalist society functions, I guess.
So you know, regarding these kinds of masks and stories and fictions, or I was just wondering if you could say more about where those fictional names or the parafictional names come from that you used in the exhibition, Raven and the others.
That's a good question. So it was interesting when the work was presented in New York. People in New York thought the names were Nigerian names, but apparently there was a publication on the piece by The Guardian in Nigeria, and I remember the author of the article asking me, like, what names are these names? Why didn't you use Nigerian names? And so the idea was me taking on the names of the artists in the show and just messing around with the names. So the names became not Nigerian, but people here thought they were Nigerian names, but they were not English words. But it was just like a mixed match, you know? So the name in itself becomes part of the idea, part of the fiction. So every artist in the show had a bio, had a full curatorial statement about their work. It was like a full curated show. The curator too, there was a curator of the show who was also an alter ego that also had a curatorial statement, you know, wrote everything out. So all of this was widely circulated during the show. And another fun part of the project was there was also an online live to that show. So there were media houses who also sent out like press releases, because I had sent out a bunch of press releases to media organizations to publish the show. And some of them were published. And it was, on social media, it was promoted on social media, but really, they didn't know it was all fictional. So it was, there was an aspect of the, fiction being seen as real. And just, like I was talking about the text by Carrie Lambert Bethy, where she talks about the moment where you're engaging fiction as reality. It means even if it's just true in that moment, then the purpose would have been served.
Thank you. Are there a couple of other questions I may have overlooked, but please make sure to speak up.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the earlier work that you did when you were in Italy, I believe you said the 1,000 red shirts, like I've noticed in a lot of your works, there's this trend of it's not only sculptural, but it's the performance aspect and how people react to it. What was the reaction that you got from the public in that? Because you said this was very important, like thing in Italy at the time was the red shirts, and then their celebration was around that same time. Did they admire it, or was it kind of this weird thing?
I mean, I guess it was admired as an artwork. Like people responded about how powerful the installation was, because it was quite large scale. It was like across 2 big buildings in Venice, and you could view it from, also from top to bottom. You could view it from maybe a different building in the city. It was important at that time because that year was the 150 years of Italian unification. And so the red shirt, I didn't even know that until I was in Venice that year, that how important the red shirt is to Italian unification. So you would have, even in museum, like the one I saw in the museum was actually one red shirt just hanging in the museum, right? And so it was actually well received in Italy, mostly because it had to do with her own pride and celebration. And even outside of Italy.
Well, do you think, like you did the green for your country, Nigeria, do you think if you would have like reversed it and did it in a different color, it would have been perceived a different way?
I don't know. I mean, the green was the national color, and for me, because also I have been interested in, the Nigerian situation, which is like everything is just like, the industries have all broken down. Like Nigeria had about 200 functional textile industries in the 60s, right? And currently they don't have up to 5 functional ones. So there's a huge dependency on importation of fabric and clothing. And of course, there's a stiff competition from China today. China is, producing a lot of textiles for the Nigerian markets, and like reproductions of woven designs, like traditional woven designs, is now being mass produced in print, in cheap print, and circulated in the country. So for me, within that context, it was important to engage that using the national color because I was speaking to the Nigerian story.
Yeah.
And I'm currently working on a similar piece that is going to be all black, and that's because I'm also thinking about, that's within the immigration story, which is also thinking about the color black and the significance of that to lost lives and to Black lives and all that. So it all depends on the project, and I think those choices could be made based on that.
Hi, Victoria. This is Nick Yeduku. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just want to ask you why the Nigerian government has placed a ban on second-hand clothes. I mean, they're very, very popular in Kenya. And then there's the other whole thing that you mentioned. I forget the event that you mentioned, and apparently Kenya was represented by 4 Chinese artists.
Yeah.
I mean, how popular is that event?
Oh, it's listen, this is a major, the Venice Biennale is one of the most prestigious platforms you want to be a part of as an artist. It's quite renowned. It's been there for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And of course, you have the post-colonials are just trying to play catch up, right? We're trying to be part of an institution that didn't really have us as part of the plan. And so all sorts has been going on as a result of that. I think Ghana made their debut the last Venice Biennale, last 2 years. So you still have some countries, some African countries that are trying to show up. And Kenya had a situation where, of course, yeah, the Chinese. That tells us about what the situation is in Kenya with the Chinese, I guess.
It's so embarrassing.
And then you had an Italian curating the show. So, and the minister had to call off that show for that reason. Yeah, so what was the other question? Sorry.
Oh, the other question was why there's a ban on second.
Oh, yes. So, I mean, like I was saying, I think the Nigerian governments have been trying to protect the local market in a way. So they tried to ban the second-hand clothing market because it does impact like local producers, right? I mean, I had a small tailoring outfit in Nigeria. Think about it. If it was more expensive to produce for me and it was cheaper to buy a quick used red shirt on the street, then you realize that the local producers are suffering. And so the government was trying to sort of control that. They did the same thing with embroidered textile. It did work in the 70s, but lately not anymore, where they create a ban to sort of boost local production. But because the local production is either not sufficient or for whatever reason, and the porous borders, of course, is always there for people businessmen to sort of bring things in and out. So, you know, but I also know that, was it Uganda? It's one of the African countries who attempted to ban used clothes, and they got, they had a threat from the United States about that, something like that had happened. So you also have the economic side where Western countries also influence the decision-making processes for those things. Right. Yeah, so it's a very complex marketplace, and yeah, and of course the idea of it being tied to humanitarianism is a whole different story.
Right, but anyway, Victoria, I totally enjoyed your presentation. I would love to invite you to Kenya and the Gikomba market, where we have second-hand stuff, where I shopped, you know, all my, you know, university undergraduate years. And once in a while, I go there for great shoes as well. So I'd love to take you there sometime.
Okay. Any more questions before we wrap it up?
We have one more question from Austin Carboni.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Austin. I think, astounded, and this will just be a brief question. I was astounded by how much fabric you use as a medium for all of your projects. And I was just wondering what your origin or start, or how did you know from like a young age, or what inspired you to start working in fabrics? Just because I personally am at UB for the costume shop and tech theater, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of work. Like getting all that stuff done behind sewing machines and probably designing. It's like an ordeal. Yeah, so it's a great. I love your body of work.
Thank you. So I trained as a tailor as the very first training I had was in tailoring before going into school to study painting. Of course, when I came back to grad school, I went into study sculpture and new genres. So what happened was my very early work were very traditional paintings because I studied painting. And, but at some point, I think I got stuck with painting because I was just exhausted with the idea of painting within its two-dimensional, the limitations of painting. Painters don't get offended within the limitation of the two-dimensionality dimension. And also looking at the painting art history, which is a very Western history that do not include me. I did not find myself within that history. And so I thought it was important for me to begin to set materials that I could work with that were connected to my own cultural history, social cultural history, rather than being invested in painting that really did not represent me in any way. And so it was at that point, because textile came naturally, because I was already doing a lot of tailoring. And so it was a material that came to me naturally to explore. And then that took me on into the whole process of, looking into the secondhand clothing industry, investigating the whole history. And eventually they became like what I would say, quote unquote, power objects for me, because I have, used it and I keep going back to it as a material to work with.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good response.
Victoria,
Yeah.
again, we thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us tonight. Very, very powerful work. We will look forward to learning more about what you're doing with your evolving research and work here as a visiting scholar through the UB Center for Diversity Innovation. And as you mentioned, you'll be around doing this mentoring program. So we look forward to that. And also thank you all very much for your great questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good to be here. And thank you for the questions. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.